Welcome to Real Estate School. Today, we're going to go over 25 of the 75 most important questions you need to know to pass your state's real estate licensing exam. So let's get started. Question number 1. In terms of real estate investment, another name for depreciation is, and your answers: A, leverage, B, cost recovery, C, liquidity, and D, intrinsic value. And the answer is B, cost recovery. Depreciation or cost recovery allows an investor to recover the cost of an income-producing asset through tax deductions over the asset's useful life. Another benefit of an owning investment property, the ability to depreciate on your tax returns. Okay, well, let's go to question number 2. When the population of a town suddenly increases, which of these is most likely to occur? And your answers are: A, rental rates will fall due to increased competition. B, demand for housing will decrease. C, new housing starts will decrease. Or D, real estate prices will increase. And your answer is D, real estate prices will increase. We don't know by how much, but if the top population of the town suddenly increases, real estate prices are going to increase. This seems like a simple question, but this is an important question nonetheless. You will get questions on your state licensing exam regarding supply and demand. It's such an important aspect of our pricing, both with listings and sales and rental prices as well. So here's my suggestion. When you get a question like this, picture a warehouse. I don't care what the product is. Is the warehouse filling up, or is the warehouse emptying out or staying empty? If the warehouse is filling up, manufacturers need to find a way to move the product so they lower their prices. Full warehouse, lower prices. If the warehouse is staying empty because of demand, then manufacturers can raise their prices because buyers compete for the product. So just think of that warehouse when you get a question like this. And our exam prep question number 3. Land, mineral, and air rights are included in the definition of, and your choices: A, attachments, B, real property, C, subsurface rights, and D, improvements. And your answer is B, real property. The key term in this question is air rights. There's 3 terms that are very familiar, or sound very familiar, that you with distinct differences between the 3 terms that you need to be familiar with: land, real estate, and real property. Land includes all the natural components: the boulders, the plants, the dirt, all the natural components. That's land. Real estate is land plus the man-made items. Man-made items are called improvements. Land or real estate is land plus improvements. And then the broadest term of the 3, real property. Real property is land plus improvements plus the legal rights that go along with ownership of real estate. And here we have land, mineral, and air rights. Air rights make this definition of real property. Exam prep question number 4. Growing trees, fences, and buildings are all considered. Just kind of gave this one away, didn't I, in the last question? Your options are A, chattels, B, land, C, fixtures, and D, real estate? And your answer is real estate. Growing trees, fences, and buildings. Growing trees are natural components, but fences and buildings are man-made items. Land is the natural components. Real estate is the natural components plus the man-made items. With the fences and buildings, that makes this the definition of real estate. You're doing well. Question number 5. Method of annexation, adaption, and agreement of the parties are the legal tests for determining whether an item is, and your answers are, a chattel or an implement. B, real property or personal property. C, land or real estate. And D, fructus naturalis or fructus industrialis. And your answer is, I think you know this one already, B, real property or personal property. Whether an item is a fixture or personal property may be determined by the method of annexation, adaptation to real estate, and the agreement of the parties. Our next question, number 6. After suffering through a tornado and then flooding from the river, the buildings were gone. The land is still there. This is an example of, and your answers are A, uniqueness, B, scarcity, C, location, or D, indestructibility. And the answer is D, indestructibility. Land cannot be destroyed, although the improvements might be removed as they are in this case. They say land is like fingerprints. There's no two parcels that are identical. At the very least, each has its own unique geographic location. But the answer here, indestructibility. Land is indestructible. Exam prep question number 7. A right or privilege tied to real property, although not necessarily a part of the property, is called A is implement, B is trade fixture, C, appurtenance, or D, a deed. A right or privilege tied to real property, although not necessarily part of the property. Good term to know here. The answer is appurtenance. An appurtenance is a right or privilege associated with the property, although not necessarily a part of it. For example, if you own a condo in a high-rise building, and along with the condo, you have 2 parking spaces in the parking garage. The parking spaces are a separate piece of property, but they're attached to ownership of the condo. And if you sell the condo, the parking space transfers with ownership. Another example would be behind that condo building is a group of boat docks. And if you own one of the condos, you own one of the boat docks. That boat dock is a separate piece of real estate, but it's tied to ownership of the condo. And again, if you sell the condo, the boat dock transfers along with it. It's written into the deed. That language that says ownership of this condo includes ownership of this boat dock. That's an appurtenance. Question number 8. An important characteristic of personal property is that it is, I like this question, an important characteristic of personal property. A, small enough to be carried by a person. B, movable. C, alive. And D, less than 100 years old. Well, one of them there certainly stands out. The answer we're looking for here is Movable. What a great way to describe personal property. It's movable. Think about it. The refrigerator would normally be considered personal property. It's movable. Your kitchen stove, the old slide in the countertop stove, cooktop range, a stove is personal property. Most homeowners or most sellers leave their stove with their house, but you can take your stove with you. It's personal property. On the other hand, instead of a stove, you have a center island with a cooktop built into the center island, and the range is built into the wall. Those items aren't movable. Those items are real property versus personal property. Very important exam prep question number 9. A homeowner planted a rose bush on the property and plans to remove it when the house is sold. The sales contract explicitly excludes the rose bush from the sale. This provision is necessary because the rose bush ordinarily is considered to be, and your answers? A trade fixture, B, personal property, C, an implement, or D, real estate. Well, what did we learn earlier? Land, real estate, and real property. The rose bush is considered real estate. D, because the rose bush is a perennial shrub, which means it comes back every year without planting it, this is considered real estate. It's part of the property, thus it will transfer with ownership. Exam prep question number 10. A deceased homeowner left the family home to the deceased second spouse, with the provision that when their surviving spouse dies, the home goes to a child by the deceased first spouse. The second spouse owns a bundle of rights but does not own the right to, and the answers are will the property, B, sell the property, C, lease the property, or D, decorate the property. Well, what are we talking about here? We are talking about a life estate. And a life estate normally ends with the death of the life tenant. They would not be able to will the property. The second spouse owns a life estate and has the entire bundle of rights except the right to will the property. Ownership will terminate upon their death. Life estate. Exam prep question number 11. A freehold estate lasts for, and the answers are A, 99 years, B, no longer than 100 years, C, an indeterminable time, and D, the number of years specified when the owner takes possession. This is a freehold estate. Well, freehold is ownership. And what do we know about ownership? Ownership lasts for an indeterminable length of time. Normally, if the use of the time of the property can be measured, it's not a freehold estate, it's a leasehold estate. If it's your property, but just for the next 5 years, you don't own that property, you're renting that property, because a freehold estate lasts for an indeterminable length of time. Exam prep question number 12. If the government acquires privately owned real estate through a condemnation suit, it is exercising its power of A, escheat, B, reverter, C, eminent domain, and D, defeasance. Defeasance, D. And the answer is, I think you know this one, eminent domain. The right of the state to acquire privately owned property for public use is eminent domain. The court action is called condemnation. Property escheats back to the state when it becomes ownerless. That is, the owner dies, leaving no heirs and no will. So look for this in a test question regarding eminent domain. If you see the word condemnation, if you see the word process, what is the process the government uses to acquire privately owned property? If you see that in the question, the process, the answer is condemnation. That's the court action the government uses to acquire privately owned property. So the process is condemnation. Important to know that, but we don't see that here. If the government acquires privately owned real estate through a condemnation suit, in this case, it's exercising its power of eminent domain. Exam prep question number 13. If the dominant estate merges with the servient estate, which of these is true? A, the easement remains in effect for the entire parcel. B, the easement is suspended but cannot be terminated. C, the easement is terminated. And D, the owner must bring a suit seeking severance of the easement from the combined properties. Wow. Okay. Well, if the dominant estate merges with the servient estate, what happens here is that the easement is terminated. That's a requirement for an easement. You have to have two owners, two separate owners. One owner has to cross one property to get to the other. One owner, no easement. Two owners are required. Exam prep question number 14. Which of these is defined as a claim, charge, or liability that attaches to real estate? And your choices are A, a lien, B, an easement, C, deed restriction, or D, encumbrance. And your answer is an encumbrance. An encumbrance is a claim, charge, or liability that attaches to real property, such as liens, easements, and deed restrictions. So they're all, liens, easements, and deed restrictions are all forms of encumbrances. But what's the definition of an encumbrance? Something that attaches to the property. It lessens its value or impairs its use, but it does not prevent transferability. Exam prep question number 15. What are deed restrictions? A, public land restrictions. B, illegal land restrictions. D, private agreements affecting the use of the land. And D, informal agreements between neighbors. And your answer is private agreements affecting the use of the land. Deed restrictions are private agreements written into the deed and are privately enforced. Examples of public restrictions include zoning and building codes. Grandfather was hoping to pass the family farm down to his grandkids, but now grandfather's faced with the unfortunate fact that he has to sell the family farm to pay the bills. Well, one thing grandfather is going to ensure is that land remains a farm forever. So in the deed to the buyer, grandfather wrote that language in the granting clause. Whoever owns this land in the future can only use it for farming purposes. Once that's put in the deed, it cannot be taken out from a typical sale from seller to buyer. Things like eminent domain, if the city wanted the property to build a high school on it, they could do that. They could change the use. But from a seller to a buyer, you could not change a deed restriction. Private agreements affecting the use of the land. Question number 16. For as long as anyone can remember, neighbors have used a footpath over a waterfront parcel to get to the river. Recently, the current owner of the waterfront property erected a fence across the path, blocking access. Which of these easements might the neighbors claim, which could require the property owner to remove the fence? Answer A, easement by necessity. B, easement by prescription. C, easement in gross. Or D, appurtenant easement. And your answer is easement by prescription. Long-time unauthorized usage may create legal rights leading to an easement by prescription. An easement in gross is a personal right often used by utility companies. An easement by necessity could be imposed by court order to provide access to a landlocked property. But here we're talking about an easement by prescription. Probably the most common example of this, your neighbor puts up a fence around their backyard. By mistake, your neighbor crosses over 6 inches onto your property. You know the fence is on your property, but 6 inches, no big deal. You don't say anything about it. Well, depending on the state, after a certain number of years, you can't make them move that fence. After a period of time, your neighbor now has an easement by prescription. They are going to have to prove that you knew the fence was on your property, though you just didn't stop it. Exam prep question number 17. Which of these cannot take title as joint tenants with rights of survivorship? Joint tenants. Letter A, spouses. B, two friends who are business partners. C, two relatives who share a house. Or D, a corporation. And your answer is D, a corporation. Because a corporation continues indefinitely until terminated by legal action, a corporation may never take title as joint tenants. A corporation is a legal entity. In the eyes of the law, law looks at a corporation as an individual person, a single person. So when a corporation owns real estate, it doesn't matter if it's an LLC or a subchapter S or what kind of corporation. When a corporation owns real estate, it's always ownership in severalty, ownership by one person or entity. Microsoft might have 400 million stockholders, but if Microsoft owns real estate, it's always ownership in severalty. Exam prep question number 18. 3 brothers bought a farm together, and the deed listed only each of their names. What form of ownership are they presumed to have taken? Your choices are A, tenants by the entirety. B, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. C, tenancy in common. And D, in severalty. And your answer is C, tenancy in common. The brothers are presumed to be tenants in common because they did not take title as joint tenants with rights for survivorship. Joint tenancy requires extra wording. Severalty ownership includes one owner. Yeah, so this was 3 brothers, and the deed listed only their name. If it was joint tenancy, that would require extra language. That wording, with rights of survivorship, normally would be written into the deed, but the deed only listed their names. Tenancy by the entirety is for husband and wife, and in severalty is ownership by one person. That leaves us C, tenancy in common. Real estate exam question number 19. 2 people, each of whom has children from previous marriage, are now marrying each other. They ask real estate professionals for advice about how to take title. What advice should the real estate professional offer? A, tenants in common, so that each 1/2 interest will go to each other's spouse's children. B, joint tenancy to protect each other, so that if one dies, the other gets the house. C, suggests that they wait until the real estate professional finds out how best to advise them. Or D, suggest they consult with an attorney. Because the choice of ownership affects the ability to transfer the real estate, has tax implications, and decides the rights of future claims, real estate professionals should tell their clients to discuss this issue with an attorney. Real estate professionals are not permitted to give legal advice. They tell us that a lot through our licensing course. We're not attorneys. We don't give legal advice. Exam prep question number 20. A will provided that the local banker take care of the deceased estate until the deceased children reach age 25. What kind of trust is this? A, testamentary trust. B, living trust. C, land trust. Or D, trust deed. And your answer is testamentary trust. A testamentary trust is established by will after the trustor's death. A living trust is established during the trustor's lifetime. So you need to know these two terms, living and testamentary trust. Living during the lifetime, testamentary trust by will. And that's our question. A will provided that the local banker take care of the deceased estate. Testamentary trust. Exam prep question number 21. Two individuals own an apartment building as joint tenants, sharing equally in the expenses and profits. One of the co-owners sells that interest by signing and delivering a deed to a buyer. Which of these statements is true? A, the buyer will become a joint tenant with the remaining owner. B, the buyer and the remaining owner will be tenants in common. C, the buyer will be a tenant in common with the remaining owner and a joint tenant with the departing owner. Or D, the conveyance will be invalid. The two individuals remain joint tenants. And your answer is the buyer and the remaining owner will be tenants in common. Here we have a joint tenancy with only two owners. A joint tenant can transfer their ownership, but by doing so, destroys the unities of time and title. The new owner comes in at a different time than the other owners, so the new owner cannot come in as a joint tenant. They come in as a tenant in common. Now, we only had two owners to begin with. If there were three or more owners, the joint tenancy would continue. But since we had only two owners to begin with, one of them selling that interest, the new owner becomes a tenant in common with the remaining owner. They're both now tenants in common. Real estate exam prep question number 22. Fee simple ownership of a cottage in a lakefront community included an undivided interest in a parking lot, a golf course, and a swimming pool, all located in the development. Based on these facts alone, the ownership interest is probably best described as A, timeshare estate, B, a timeshare use, C, a condominium, or D, a cooperative. And your answer is a condominium. It appears that this is a condominium ownership because it includes the cottage as well as the interest in the common elements. Cooperative ownership is ruled out because the ownership does not have a proprietary lease. It is not a timeshare because it includes more than the right to use the property at a specific time. You know, the main two possibilities, condominium and cooperative. If you get a question on cooperative, it's normally stock ownership. That's a cooperative owner, right? A cooperative owner owns stock in a corporation that has only one asset, the building, and then they lease a condo back from the corporation that they own a share of. That's a cooperative. So they normally, when they give you a question, it's regarding stock, shares of stock. That's a cooperative. A condominium, if you own a condominium, you own your unit in severalty, and you share ownership of the common areas with the other condo owners as a tenant in common. ownership and severalty combined with tenancy in common. So that's what we're talking about here, condominium. Exam prep question number 23. A trust is created to pay for a student's college education. An attorney makes payments on behalf of the student directly to the college. Based on these facts, which of these statements best characterizes the relationship among the parties to the trust? A, the attorney is the trustor. The student is the beneficiary, and the creator of the trust is the trustee. B, the creator of the trust is the trustor. The college is the beneficiary, and the attorney is the trustee. C, the creator of the trust is the trustor. The student is the beneficiary, and the attorney is the trustee. Or D, the creator of the trust is the trustor. The attorney is the trustee, and the college is the fiduciary. I have to give you another extra few seconds on this one. And your answer is C. The creator of the trust is the trustor. The student is the beneficiary. They benefit. They are having their college education paid for. And the attorney is the trustee. They're holding the money, controlling the trust. The creator of the trust is the trustor. C is our answer. Exam prep question number 24. When a corporation takes complete ownership of a property, the ownership is in, kind of let you know about this one earlier, didn't we? A corporation owning real estate, the ownership is A, joint tenancy, B, tenancy in common, C, partnership, or D, severalty. And your answer is D, severalty. Corporations are artificial persons and may hold ownership in severalty. D. And finally, for this set of questions, question number 25. In a tenancy in common, if the fractions of ownership are not stated in the deed, how are they determined? A, the tenants need a judicial decision to determine the fractional shares. B, the tenants are presumed to hold equal shares. C, the tenants settle the issue through binding arbitration. Or D, the tenants must terminate the tenancy in common through a partition. And your answer is the tenants are presumed to hold equal shares. A deed creating a tenancy in common may or may not state the fractional interest held by each co-owner. If no fractions are stated, the tenants are presumed to hold equal shares. With a tenancy in common, you can have unbalanced ownership. One person owns 30%, another person owns 40%, somebody else has 20%. You can have that. But that would be stated in the deed, the fractional ownership interest. If no fractions are stated in the deed, the tenants are presumed to hold equal shares then.